So Diana, why is it a better idea to have a Canadians domestic women's pro league instead of just expanding the NWSL?
I think it's one of those things where the more you think about it, you see what a bigger impact a Canadian professional league will have. Literally a magnitude bigger, 10 times the players, fans, coaches, referees, performance trainers, administrators, GMs, CEOs, everything to do with the professional sport landscape. You're going to have a much bigger impact with a league versus just an NWSL club. And it's also very American, this idea of having American franchises in Canada. You don't see that around the rest of the world, especially in soccer. And I want to compete with them, but I want to compete with them with Canadian clubs in a Canadian league and go after Champions League titles in North America. That's where I want to compete with the US. I don't want to have one of their franchises up here. The franchise fees right now are $24 million to get into the NWSL. And $25 million. And if I want to see a $25 million investment into Canadian soccer, I want that money to stay right here in Canada. So for me, it's pro league all the way.
Okay, got you. So before we get into the money, why is it better to have two distinct leagues than it is just to funnel all of the best players into one league, regardless of where they come from?
Yeah, I think if you let two leagues operate in one country, you're just splitting the market, right? You're splitting the market for players, for fan attention, for sponsorship dollars. And in a Canadian league, we just get to control the product, right? We get to set the standards for that league. We get to make sure we're hiring Canadians. An NWSL franchise would be in a US league, so we just have less control over it. We'd probably only have half the number of Canadians on that roster. We'd be adhering to a lot of the rules that already exist in the NWSL. So the differences are behind the scenes too, and we get to shape the future of our league versus tacking onto an American system.
Okay, so in men's basketball, you have the NBA, you have the G League, you also have the CEBL that kind of feeds the G League, but women's pro soccer it's a profoundly different landscape. So tell me, how would a Canadian league and an American league coexist?
Well, I think they coexist by keeping the NWSL in the US and not letting it come to Canada, and then building a world-class women's professional league up here. I think that the differences you mentioned, for men's basketball in Canada and even men's soccer, we had an NBA team in Canada before the CEBL came. We already had MLS before the Canadian Premier League came. So they are or were positioned as Tier 2 leagues. I think looking at women's soccer, we have a blank slate on which to build. We have one of the biggest player pools in the world. We have some of the best talent in the world. And we have people across this country that are excited to be involved in a future women's professional league.
So women's soccer, obviously, from a player participation standpoint, is really popular. Commercially, we don't know. So how would a thriving pro league help bridge that gap between participation and commercial appeal?
Women's sport, I think, has a lot in the past been kind of a victim of underinvestment up front. So the money hasn't gone in at the beginning, so the stadiums have suffered, the marketing has suffered. It hasn't been very accessible on mainstream broadcasts. I struggle to find an NWSL game still. And, if I'm not in their market, who is? So one of the things is you have to invest up front and you have to believe in the product so people are able to see it. So often in the past, people just didn't see women's professional sport. And if they did, the production quality was low or XYZ that really undermined the on-field product. We have to invest in a product we believe in Canada. And we have the fans here. I have no doubt we have the fans here. Canadians have been watching the women's soccer team perform for a decade. Our fan base is incredible. There's 15 million soccer fans in Canada already. That's more than in the that's more people than are in Portugal. And it's growing. Women's soccer brings in 1 out of every 3 fans is new to the sport. So I firmly believe if we bring the talent to Canada, we give them teams to play in, and we show it to the Canadian public, we're going to get the support.
So Diana, if we look at other countries, what have we learned about how to make a professional women's domestic soccer league work?
Yeah, great question. And like I said, there's no blueprint for how it's done. When we look at women's soccer leagues around the world, there's been a few different routes. In Europe, it's mostly been through those massive men's soccer clubs. So, your PSG, your Olympique Lyon, your Manchester United, Chelsea, et cetera, those big clubs that can really support the women's game by putting money in. Another route has been through soccer federations investing in their pro game. Another route in Mexico has been to partner fully with the men's league that has been around, for decades and decades, 17 teams all paired with women's clubs. The men's clubs are all financially stable enough, they can do that. That's been really successful in Mexico. If you look at the US, independent model. So they were apart from the whole system. They found sponsors and owners that believed in the women's game, and they built independently. So what can we learn from all those? I think, again, you have to build what's right for a Canadian market. A few things we've learned from the NWSL is there has to be more diversity of thought at the table to begin with. There's been issues in that league and in Canadian sport around safe sport because of a lack of diversity of thought at the table. We really need to address those things in building a Canadian league here. And the other one is just upfront investment. If you believe in the product, we got to put in the money up front, and there's a really exciting market right now in Canada where I think we can do really good things. So those are the two main learnings from me from around the world.